Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session on poverty and financial security. Thank you very much for choosing to be here. I'm Claire McNeil. I'm a director of an organisation called Timewise, and I used to run IPPR's work on poverty and equality for many years. So I'm delighted to be chairing this event today. We are focused on plans for power at this conference, obviously. And if it is successful at the next election, Labour faces the very exciting prospect of being able to take forward its plans to break down barriers to opportunity in this country. But I think it's also probably fair to say that the scale of the challenge Labour faces is arguably nowhere greater than on this issue of how we reduce poverty and inequality in this country. The basic essentials of food, housing, and energy are just unaffordable for millions. We have levels of poverty in this country which are violating international law. And as many of us see in our work, the myth that work is a route out of poverty is becoming plain for us all to see. So, first of all, here to tell us how Labour might approach tackling these challenges, we have Liam Byrne MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill and chair of the Business Trade Select Committee, who is going to start off this panel. Liam's fresh from a number of fascinating committee sessions and also the publication of a new book. So over to you, Liam.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Liam Byrne, and I'm going to just kick off this panel by sharing with you a few thoughts. I think I've got about 10 minutes, which is, as we say in Westminster, the average lifespan of a Tory Chancellor. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts from a rather good new book. It's by me. It's called The Inequality of Wealth. It came out last week, available in all good bookstores and on Amazon. But above all, what I want to do is share with you, amidst this kind of politics of gloom and despair that we risk, I want to share with you some hope. I want to share with you the politics of hope about how our principles, our purpose, and our power could actually forge a new settlement of freedom and security in our country, because we have to confront the reality that there is no freedom without security and there is no security without wealth. But right now, we have a situation where 70% of the wealth in our country is in the hands of the luckiest 1%. Now, we have been thinking about wealth in this country since that great work of Adam Smith all those years ago. And since I was born in the holy town of Warrington back in 1970, the wealth of our country has basically multiplied 100-fold to round about 12 trillion pounds. That is a very big number. It's very difficult to get your head around. But if you take that standard unit of measurement from Land's End to John O'Groats, you could basically pave a path from Land's End to John O'Groats 5 gold bars wide. That's how much 12 trillion pounds is. But here's the inconvenient truth. For most of my life, wealth inequality in our country was going down. Since 2010, it's been going up. In fact, since 2010, it's been going up so fast that the top 1% have multiplied their wealth by 31 times more than everybody else. That is how bad wealth inequality has now become in our country. And so that is why we now have the scandal of sales of luxury cars, luxury homes, luxury jets at an all-time high, when we have food banks in my constituency that are literally running out of food. We have people going into hospital with malnutrition and rickets. We have life expectancy in Britain's poorest areas, which is not going up, it is actually going down. That is how we are now divided into a world of haves, have-nots, and have-yots. Now, even if you don't care about the basic injustice of this, actually, you should care about this. If you look around the world, unequal nations are unhappy nations. They've got 3 things in common. They are poor, they are corrupt, and they are stagnant. And, you know, as much as we might look at distaste at the kind of absurdity of affluence, the kind of conspicuous consumption, the thing that should worry us most is the inconspicuous consumption, not of things, but of power. And that is what I now see more than ever after nearly 20 years in politics. It is always the case that inequality is the fountainhead of corruption. And I don't need to convince you lot, you guys, you here today, that that is now a problem that is imperiling our country. I can just leave you with 3 letters, PPE. But here's the problem. You know, I came into politics, my first job in politics was in 1996 in Millbank Town, those heady days when, you know, we used to go home singing, things can only get better. But the problem with wealth inequality is it's not going to get better on its own. It's only going to get better if we choose as a party, as a movement, as a government to do something about it. Because nothing's forever, including the baby boomers. And as the baby boomers shuffle off their mortal coil in this country, we're about to see a wealth transfer of £5.5 trillion, the biggest wealth transfer in our economic history. But some are going to inherit fortunes, right? But some are going to inherit care bills. So what we now are about to see is Gen Z, that extraordinary generation born since the millennium, about to become the most unequal generation for half a century. And what we know about politics is that when you have inequalities like that, you get a politics of toxicity. So we in our party, we've always known that it's wrong, that some people are more equal than others. We know that the worst of tyrannies is the tyranny of poverty. And we know that there are millions of our neighbours who are now prisoners of their anxiety because they can't afford to put food on the table or switch on the heating. So we've been talking now, you know, as an international community for at least a decade about the rising level of inequality. This year is the 10th anniversary of Piketty's book on capital, which I know many Fabians will have read, not just in summary, but all of it. But look, we've got to sort of shift on from talking about the problem to talking about the solutions. And so that's what the book tries to do. And the book uses a framework developed by James Mead back in the 60s, a disciple of Keynes, one of the great British economists, a Nobel Prize winner. And what Mead did is he basically said, look, if you care about wealth inequality, you've got to do 5 things. You've got to worry about growth, you've got to worry about earnings, you've got to worry about savings, you've got to worry about the return on those savings, and you've got to worry about tax. And, you know, I'm still kind of new Labour enough to love a 5-point plan. And that is basically the structure of the solutions that the book goes through. So look, on growth, we know that if we want to grow richer, we've got to grow smarter. Globally, innovation spending has tripled since 2000. It's only gone up by 40% in this country. Yet innovation is the power and superpower. If we want to grow richer, we have to grow smarter. We have to increase the level of investment in innovation. But instead of hoarding all of that in Westminster and Whitehall, we have got to have a radical devolution of power and resources to the regions so that instead of today's economic growth muddle, we actually have a proper model that helps regions and cities and towns build the institutions they need to actually foster a faster growth of knowledge-intensive jobs. Knowledge-intensive jobs pay 30% over and above the national average, but right now, half of them are in London and the South East. Second, we need to stop the race to the bottom amongst British firms. That means a second big bang here in the heart of the city. Right now, we have too many firms that are screwing their workers, dodging their taxes and poisoning the planet. Yet, where do they get their money from? They get it from us, from pension savers. We together as pension savers put £2 trillion of savings aside now. Yet, it's impossible for us to invest in firms that are doing the right thing. So a second big bang would consolidate the 32,000 pension funds that we got into this country into a handful of super funds like they have in Canada and Australia, and actually make it easier for us as pension savers to put our money in firms that were doing the right thing for their workers, not the wrong thing. Third, we do need, in my view, not universal basic income, but something I call universal basic capital. What that means is universal savings accounts. They've just been piloted by Nest. They proved an enormous success. If we couple that with your auto-enrollment pension account and your individual learning account, you could actually have universal savings for people. And then you can begin looking holistically at the 60 billion pounds that we currently put in to what Richard Titmuss called fiscal welfare, which overwhelmingly provides subsidies to those who are rich. Actually making sure that we incentivize those without assets is the first step that we've got to take. But key amongst that is an idea that the IPPR pioneered of putting in for every young person a tax break or a match saving of up to £10,000 so that people can actually afford some of the most important capital in their lives, which is their housing capital. Now, if you put it in as a tax break and a savings match, actually it's incredibly popular. Where does that money come from? By reinventing something we should have done when we got rid of North Sea oil revenues. We should have created a sovereign wealth fund back then, like the canny Norwegians. In fact, if we'd done that back then, we'd have a sovereign wealth fund worth £500 billion. So look, let's learn from the past. Let's fix that mistake from the past. Let's build a sovereign wealth fund here for the UK today to make sure there is that deposit dividend for the next generation to get started in life. That will take a little bit of time to build, but you know what? It would be faster to build if we restored fairness to the tax system. Since the turn of the century, investment income has multiplied to around £80 billion. Now, if you are, say, Rishi Sunak, you draw most of your income from investment income. Now, I don't know how many people have read Rishi Sunak's tax return. Okay, well, it's lucky I've done it for you because, on Rishi's last tax return, he declared income of £2 million. Anyone want to guess the rate of tax on that? 21%. So at a time when 1 in 5 people in our country are now paying up to 40% marginal rates, Rishi Sunak on £2 million a year is paying 21%. Now, there are 101 ways in which you can restore fairness to the tax system. The book lays out, a number of them. Lots of them are ideas that have come from the Wealth Tax Commission. This is not something I would put on a pledge card because it's very complicated and it's the kind of thing that you have to do in power, not in opposition. But, if we're to make sure that the second and third manifestos of the next Labour government are radical documents, frankly, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to restore fairness to this country if we have a tax system, a tax code that reflects our moral code. So that's the basic argument of the book. Foster faster growth, create a kind of civic capitalism, roll out universal basic capital, helped paid for by sovereign wealth funds, paid for by restoring fairness to the tax code. These are not mad ideas. These are all ideas that have worked somewhere around the world. They're all ideas that could win Britain's vote and definitely would change Britain's future. The final point I just want to make before I sit down is, look, we should be optimists about the possibilities of the future. 90% of the scientists that have ever worked are alive today. The breakthroughs that they are going to make over the years to come, whether that is artificial intelligence or quantum computing or genetic medicine or global gigabit connectivity or the shift to green energy, these things are going to change the way we live. We already see the things that were once a matter of science fiction becoming realities in our lives. This is not H.G. Wells, this is Tunbridge Wells today. So, we should be optimistic about the future. The wealth of the world is going to grow by £100 trillion between now and 2060. We could choose as a movement to build, restore, bring back, resurrect a renaissance of that old idea, once shared by left and right, of the wealth-owning democracy. That would be the way that we could build a new settlement of freedom, security, and wealth, not just for some, but for all. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks so much for that, Liam. And I think it reflects the fact that, assets and wealth play such a huge role in determining life chances compared to the last time that Labour was riding high in the polls in 96. So I'll turn now to the panel, who have just 3 minutes each before we open up for discussion and hear some questions from all of you. They have been asked to think about what Labour's key priorities should be over the next 5 years to reduce poverty and improve financial security, which groups in society need support most, what can the party do to improve household finances without extra public spending, and what issues should have the first call on any new money that is found the other side of the election. So first of all, I will turn to Saskia Otto. Saskia is a senior researcher at the Fabian Society. Her work focuses on tech policy and work and skills. So over to you, Saskia.
Thank you, Claire. I am really glad that Liam spoke about good work, because workers in this country have suffered a lost decade. The result is that we have a longer average full-time work week and are more likely to say that we often work under pressure than any of our EU neighbours. If you can't work full-time hours, you earn a third less than everyone else. But either way, your health could be at risk, if not from overwork, then from over-controlled working conditions or other pressures such as poor occupational health management. It's no wonder that the number of people who say they feel stressed at work has been going up and is currently at 73%. These problems reduce productivity, they reduce earnings, and they reduce public sector capacity we need to tackle some of the underlying drivers of poverty, such as health inequalities. And this is because firms who have these problems tend to be less productive, they tend to be less efficient, and also because people such as women, such as disabled people, such as people at the beginning and the end of their careers, are either paid less than their worth or excluded from the labour market altogether. To illustrate the scale of the problem, we have 2.6 million people off long-term sick at the moment, and this is higher than it's ever been since records began. We recently surveyed over 50s who are in financial difficulty, and we found that stress at work interacts with health difficulties to push them out of work. And this is serious. While the Prime Minister laughs at health workers when raising concerns on the street, our survey finds that of those struggling financially, 1 in 5 are on a waiting list and say for that reason, they're unable to work. We lost 150,000 healthcare workers during the pandemic because they left work early. So what can be done? We published some reports last year on improving working conditions in the UK, and we're about to publish a report on tackling poverty in the age bracket where it is most prevalent, which is the years leading up to state pension age. So I'm not going to do too many spoilers. Some of the Fabian recommendations already out there probably won't surprise you. Of course, we need a right to flexible work from day one. And it shouldn't, the worker shouldn't have to justify why it happens. It should be up to the employer to say why it's not possible, and the employer should specify what options are available at the recruitment phase. We've recommended new rights to paid carers leave and paid disability leave and sick pay that you can live on. And we've recommended that we set up a national occupational health service. And all of these recommendations are fiscally neutral. Even the occupational health service, because of potentially reduced sick pay. I read a couple of chapters of Liam's book and I absolutely love them, and fully agree that we need to change incentives for employers. And I really like the idea of using pension funds to do that. And I think we can even take that idea a little bit further and bring more employers into the fold by putting a duty on employers to monitor and work with trade unions to address where worker well-being falls short. I'm not going to say any more. You'll have to watch out for the report to find out more. Come speak to me afterwards. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks, Saskia. Over to Caroline Abrahams now. Caroline is Charity Director for Age UK, and Caroline was a special advisor under the last Labour government, and she spent her career in the voluntary and public sectors working on family, children and care issues. Caroline.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here today. I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to make 3 quick points, or I'm going to try to. I think the first one, going back to my background working around children and family issues, I mean, I think what we've got at the moment and have had for a while is essentially a hostile environment for people who are on universal credit. So I think although it can't be done quickly, there's a lot that the next Labour government needs to do to gradually dismantle that hostile environment, to remove or water down the conditionality, because we know, and I'm conscious, I've got a colleague here from JRF here who will know much more about this than me, but we know that basically it's impossible to live at a decent level on the level of benefit that's currently available. So that must be an absolutely huge and long-term priority for future government. The second group I wanted to point out is exactly the one that colleague has just been talking about, that she's writing what I hear is going to be a great report, so watch out for it. And it's that group of people coming up to retirement, people aged between about 50 and 66. Now, some of those people are in Liam's category of the 1% who are doing fantastically well. And a lot of them actually are doing quite well. But if you're in trouble in that age group, you're in big trouble, because you're stuck on universal credit, which wasn't designed for you, that imposes harsh conditionality. It's not enough to live on. You might, if you're lucky enough to have any savings, you might have to draw on those then, not during your retirement, just to make ends meet. It's disproportionately people who are women, who are disabled, who are chronically unwell, who are from minoritized communities, who are caring, who are in that position. So there is more we need to do, not least because actually we need to get as many of those people back to work and earning a fair wage, so that they can then look forward to a much more prosperous retirement and pay back to the British economy. And then finally, there's people who have actually retired, older people, the people that I'm paid to think about at the moment at Age UK. And of course, again, some of those are doing okay, but quite a lot of them aren't. Actually, if you've had a very poor life, then you look forward to that guaranteed £9,000 a year or so that you might get as a state pension, because, and those years running up to that are a struggle. But of course, £9,000 a year is not very much to live on. And really, if you're going to be able to live decently and you're on that very low income, you need to be claiming the means tested benefit that tops it up, which is called pension credit. But for years and years and years, a third of older people entitled to that haven't claimed it. And really, governments have colluded with that. And I bet it's baked into the Treasury model that a third of people don't take that money. That means upwards of 800,000 people of households are actually stuck on such a low income that they really have struggled to get through this winter, for example. It's been the last couple of years with inflation has been really tough for that group. So we need to do more to think about how do we support older people on incredibly low incomes. Is it through pension credit? It probably isn't. It's probably about finding a different way of automatically getting money to those groups. And now with technology, you can data match. There are ways of identifying those people. We know roughly where those people live. They live in poor areas in particular clusters. We could do more to get them the money. So that's my 3-point plan for a future Labour government.
Great, thanks so much, Caroline. A lot on these priority groups that a Labour government would need to be focused on. Right, I'll turn now to Abby Jitendra. Abby is Principal Policy Advisor at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where she leads on care, family and relationships. Abby.
Thanks so much, Claire. So I just want to root this discussion in some of the sort of reality of what we see out there. So 1 in 5 people are in poverty, and that means 6 million people are in very, very deep poverty. Now, that's massive numbers, and it's really hard to sort of root that in the reality of what's going on. But I'll just use an anecdote. So my first job in policy was at the Trussell Trust, which is the largest network of food banks in the country. And when I joined, there was 1 million food bank parcels that were given out, and that was regularly on the front pages of newspapers. That number is now 3 million food bank parcels given out. And that is, I think most people can agree, unacceptable, because we know that financial security is the anchor for households. And we also know that cost of living and the economy consistently polls top of people's concerns. So when people vote later this year, one of the things they will be thinking most readily is, am I better off than I was the last time I voted? Are my friends, my family and my community better off? So this really gets to the heart of what people care about. So turning to sort of drivers, why have those numbers got so much worse? So JRF and the Trussell Trust do lots of work, really digging into why that is. And I mean, there could be a whole day session on those drivers. But just in summary, we know that costs are very volatile. We know that very neatly in the cost of living crisis. We know that wages have until very recently not kept up. And we also know things like care or ill health mean that you cannot sort of engage in the labour market, which means you are left on very inadequate social security kind of payments, which I'll come to in a second. So the question of how to solve this without public spending is a really tricky one, because one of the reasons we've got into this mess is because lots of money has been taken out of public services and out of social security. But there are ways to solve this problem for free. Things like care markets. I work on care now alongside Caroline, and you could look at some of the profits that are being extracted through adult social care now, childcare, children's social care, and make sure that any public money that is going into the system is at least going to workers and people. That would definitely save some money. You can also look at cheaper ways of solving the problem, like, as Saskia said, paid care leave. That's something that JRF has been pushing on really hard since I joined, because there are ways that you can help people balance care and work without going onto the social security system, which we know is inadequate. But the elephant in the room is that social security, the payments that you get if you can't work, if you really have nowhere else to turn, just simply are not enough. And JRF has been calling for something called an essentials guarantee, because there is currently no relationship between the actual cost of living and your benefit payments. So that was an arbitrary number set many, many years ago that really has nothing to do with the cost of energy, the cost of food. And actually, can we do a better job of linking the two up? And unfortunately for Liam and others, that does cost money. And so the question comes to how do we pay for it? And we've got some ideas on how to do that. But really, I'd take a step back from that and say, if the point of government is not to protect the most vulnerable people in society, then what is? I think we need to look very long and hard at what a future Labour government would, how would it look different to the governments that we've had in the last few years? And I think one way is that you would look at the growing number of people who are homeless, the growing number of people who are hungry, and think that those numbers are going in the wrong way. And so I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Great, thanks, Abby. I'm going to come back to that sort of tension that Abby raised before coming to you for questions. So we know that there's a very, very tough, there would be a very, very tough fiscal context. We know that Labour has very tough fiscal rules, no borrowing for day-to-day spending, just investment. So to put the panel slightly on the spot before we come to you for questions, what would Liam, a lot of what you talked about is, I think you've said, a second term, a third term set of priorities for this first term. We know that the UN Special Rapporteur, I mentioned earlier, Abby, JRF, saying the same thing, that universal credit is the most effective thing that you can do if you're serious about tackling poverty and improving financial security. So what would those priorities be for a first term where we know that there is little said right now about spending and investment plans?
So from my point of view, I mean, I think Rachel is bang on to say that growth has got to be the first priority, because basically, resources multiply if the rate of growth goes up. We've had terrible rates of growth over the last 13 years. So the kind of plans that Gordon Brown set out about radical devolution of economic power, actually that will dramatically help us as a country increase the growth model. So that is the first thing. The second thing that I think we have to do step by step, but with a very clear long-term plan, is pick up what Abby and Caroline and others have talked about, which is just making sure that we have a care system that is worth its name. Now, for me, I think the most important space you develop that is in childcare. In my constituency, we have one of the lowest rates of maternal employment in the country. That's fundamentally connected to the fact that across Birmingham, we now have 43% of children living in poverty. Think about that. Almost half of the children in Britain's second city are now living in poverty. So, but rolling childcare out means that you will bring workers back into the economy, and that in turn is something that is good for growth. I know this is a bit sort of controversial, but I mean, I do think that we have to find ways to look at unfairness in the tax system. I mean, again, it's the kind of thing that you have to do in government rather than in opposition. But, when you think about the way our economy has changed, the value of wealth has tripled this century alone. The income from wealth has doubled this century alone. But that's not the only inequities in the tax system. If you think about the amount of pension tax relief that goes to top rate taxpayers, that's about 21 billion a year. If you look at the amount of tax savings, tax breaks that go to people with over £100,000 in ISAs, that's about 2 billion a year. So, you have got these really significant inequities in the tax system that we've got to kind of look at in the round. So growth, care, tax, those are my three.
Thanks. Anyone else on the panel before I go to questions? Any thoughts on that? We haven't touched on housing.
Housing is very important, and obviously also a racial justice issue, because just kind of from the report I'm writing at the moment, most ethnic minorities live in cities and are renting, up to when they reach state pension age. So I think that's really important. I just wanted to reflect on the kind of growth versus social security point. When I was writing this report on kind of poverty leading up to the state pension age, there was a tension, because I've just spent a lot of time speaking about work, and I think that is, a very important medium to long-term project to kind of sustainably improve quality of life. But it's not going to happen overnight. That's the problem. And there's just are people who are, in dire straits right now. And so I just wanted to kind of echo what Abby said, and that, social security will play a role in raising quality of life. And I don't think we can get away with that. But I recognize that there is a sort of, there are difficult decisions to be made. And so, we do need to think about kind of, who's in a particularly difficult situation, and how do we prioritize?
Yeah, Caroline.
Yeah, one quick point from me to cheer everyone up a bit, which is I think something will change overnight. So I've got a really good mate who works in DWP. He's worked there for a long time. Not everybody who's working in government departments is a wrong one, by the way. There's lots of people there who want to work in a different kind of way and will, are counting the days basically until there's a change of government. And he said that he was working in DWP before Tony Blair was elected. And he said overnight, the instruction changed from your job is to stop people getting their benefits to your job is there to help people get their benefits. And I'm confident that's what would happen with the election of a Labour government. And I cannot overstate what a difference that makes. It doesn't cost money as such, but it means that the whole tone gradually changes throughout the system, so that when someone goes into a job centre or talks to an advisor, they're not disparaged. They're treated, the whole tone of the conversation change. And over time, those ways that people are tricked out of their money essentially are tripped up by all sorts of unfair rules. The benefit of the doubt goes the other way. So I think that would have a really big impact. But of course, there's a lot more to do.
Great, fantastic. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions. I am going to take questions in threes. Can we go to this gentleman here in the second row? Please just state the question and your
Thank
name,
you.
if you can.
Duncan Hames, Transparency International. Liam speaks about the inconspicuous consumption of wealth and, importantly, power. How can a future government hope to plan to tax wealth more fairly when people not very far from where we're all sat today work so hard to keep it hidden and to give the impression that, in fact, it resides offshore?
Thank you. And we'll have the lady next to him.
Thank you, Sheila. I wanted to follow up Liam's point about redistributing some wealth to young people, which seems an interesting idea. But at every level of income, and I'm sure the others on the panel will confirm this, is the vulnerability to a sudden shock, a loss of income, getting ill, losing a job, whatever, that hits people who don't have any savings at all. Do you have any plans for giving people access to anything from the same sort of endowment at other ages to just free 1 year's credit to get through the gap.
Great, thank you. So I didn't catch your name, Sheila.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, and we'll go to this lady at the front here.
Hello, Beth Lacani, and I apologize for arriving late and not hearing the opening speech, but I will get the book.
Thank you.
Just one or 2 points, questions about the enabling issue. One of the issues is about uprating social security benefits. In fact, the people who suffer the most hardship are suffering the most hardship because the level of uprating doesn't reflect the items that are going up the most or have been going up the most and are likely to do so for some time. And therefore, we have to look at that issue. I agree about the whole issue of enabling, of turning things around, but turning it round in such a way that we don't talk about hostile society, because that we have to recognize that a lot of people are hostile. And certainly when I was working at Child Poverty Action, we picked that up all the time. People were hostile towards people who were claiming benefits. It wasn't just the government, Labour or Tory. And I have to say, Labour governments have been very careful with their use of words. So they always talk about working people, but it's people who are not working, who may be doing exceptionally useful work by caring, who are equally important in society. So how are you going to, is there going to be a movement within the party to turn this question round? And as part of that, money has to come from the rich. And one idea would be perhaps to sell it on the basis of something that everyone wants, a hypothecated wealth tax for the top one, from the 1%, towards the NHS and the National Care Service to get it going, because we have to have the money, and increased tax for those at the top 5%, because they have made a bomb in the last 10 years.
Great, thank you.
We have to get it back. Otherwise, we've got to use straightforward words. People will say, who are reasonably well off, I'm paying too much tax. But the people at the top aren't paying a fair amount. So it's always relating it.
Thank you. for that
Sorry.
question.
I'm-
Thank you. Excellent questions. Liam, I'll come to you first of all on how do we tax more fairly first of all?
Yeah, so I think if you've got a higher rate of growth, better care system, fairer tax system, you can actually do the kinds of things that Abby has set out. So for those of you who have not seen it, the work that JRF and Trussell have done on the Essentials Guarantee is probably one of the most important bits of public policy that we've seen in the last couple of years. And it's disarmingly simple, which is that we should actually look at what the cost of living is when we set the basic rates of universal credit. And having spent a lot of time reading the polling that JRF and others have done around it really helps disarm a lot of the objections that you flag, because actually people do think that people in this country should have the essentials. If you kind of say, look, we are the 6th richest country on earth, it is wrong that people cannot afford to put food on the table for their children. Do you agree? Almost everyone will agree with that proposition. So actually, I think JRF and Trussell have done the Labour movement an enormous service in the work that they've done around the Essentials Guarantee. Now, how do you sort of accelerate the way that you fund it? Growth is obviously one thing, but we've got to remember, again, back to your point, we've put £850 billion in quantitative easing into the economy over the last 10 years. That means if you own assets, the value of those assets has just gone through the roof, but we've not taken anything back for that great subsidy. So, there are lots of ideas in play, like ending the non-DON tax break, like, for example, charging national insurance contributions on investment income, equalizing the rate of tax on investment income compared to regular income, like that radical old socialist Nigel Lawson. Those ideas alone bring in about £30 billion a year. If you then put a 1% tax on the fortunes, 22,000 fortunes worth over 10 million, that brings you another 11 billion on top. So look, a billion here, a billion there, it starts to add up after a while, especially if you can fix the problem that Duncan Hames flags, which is making sure that you stop this leakage of wealth being hidden abroad by this incredible impunity industry that we have in this country, and the kind of work that TI, Transparency International, is pioneering around making sure that there's proper declarations of offshore trusts and that kind of thing. So there's real transparency, cracking down on economic crime in the way the Tories haven't. That is all part of making sure that we've got a tax base that we can see. And then the task for Labour, I'm afraid, is to win a political argument about then taxing it fairly. If you do that, you can pay for the kinds of ideas that Abby's talked about.
Thank you. Abby, I'll just come to you on that last point on uprating benefits in case there's anything you want to add. I mean, we are the only one of the only countries in the world that has a completely arbitrary way of setting universal credit. It's a complete scandal. Abby.
I mean, not much more to say than what's already been said, but I mean, first of all, it's really heartening to hear Liam talk about some of the ways that you can raise money. So, I mean, that in itself is just really positive. Just to pause for a second on care, I do think there's something that we really are missing about the productive capacity of childcare and other kinds of work that essential work that carers do. And actually, the current government did take some quite decisive steps to expand the childcare system in ways that will make a measurable difference to many people. There are lots of issues with it that we have made clear about who is being supported best, but actually we are sort of in moving in the right direction. We're on a juggernaut that is kind of quickly gaining pace about how brilliant it is for the government to help people care, to take some of the burden of care off people, help people get into work, but also help them do it themselves. And I mean, I'm not an expert on this in the way that Caroline is, but more and more of us are going to need to be caring for our loved ones, and more of us will need care. If you take the next 10, 20 years in an aging society, this is going to become a big issue. And so, yeah, anything which better values that care and helps people stay in work or do work while those care needs increase is going to make a huge difference.
Thank you. And Sheila's question on vulnerability to shock and savings, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very important point. If you look at the stats about how much savings people have behind them in this country, it's frightening because large numbers of people have virtually no savings at all, or none. And obviously, if your boiler goes wrong, if some major event happens at home, and that will have happened to loads of people this winter, you don't necessarily have any way of doing anything about it. So, yeah, pleased to say that the last Labour government that I worked for certainly brought into being child trust funds, which was absolutely an acknowledgement from Gordon Brown that it's very hard to live your life with nothing behind you. We need to give young people that good start in life. But over and above that, one of the other things that's happened over the last few years is that the capacity of public bodies like councils to be able to make grants to people who are in financial difficulty, that's all gone as well. So I think in a way what that alludes to is it's not just the benefit system that's in trouble, it's that the whole safety net built around it, that Labour government's built around it, with public services working together to support people, that's gone as well. So that's a big job to start putting back together again. But I think that is going to be the task of the next Labour government.
Saskia.
Thank you. Just to add to the points on saving and also what you said about kind of people demonizing people who are on benefits. One of the things that we found with the research that we did was that people who have been up against it for various reasons, whether that's because they've had caring responsibilities, disability, or whatever else, have quite low savings later in life, kind of in their pension pot and whatever. But when they drop out of work, they're more likely to rely on those savings, however small they are, than they are to claim benefits, even though they are in a financially difficult situation. And there's a bunch of complex reasons behind it. It's cultural, it's kind of knowledge of the benefit system, it's kind of how your pension savings and other types of savings interact with benefits entitlement. But there's a bunch of stuff that we need to think about when it comes to savings. And obviously kind of, it sort of builds up and then kind of reaches a crescendo in later life.
Okay, one more round of questions. I think we'll go towards the back of the room this time. Let's start with the gentleman there, kind of halfway. Yes, just do you have your, yeah, that's it.
Ron Sankla here. Thank you very much for that speech, Liam. Like the George Orwell reference in there. Curious to get your thoughts on inheritance tax, and perhaps we leave aside the pretty obvious ones of clamping down on exemptions, which is something which has been talked about quite a lot. Maybe we get your thoughts on the percentage of inheritance tax, or pros and cons if you're not able to comment, but would appreciate your thoughts there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll take the one from the gentleman in the stripy jumper in the front of that row.
Yeah, obviously a lot of our wealth is actually built into the housing market, and I think that we believe that, you know, this nation is quite wealthy. I live in the southeast. I am the founder of the Uckfield Community Fridge. We see people coming in who would classify themselves as middle class or wealthy, coming in and getting food because they can't. All their assets are built into the house when they leave. I think we're going to see a big bust in this country because we're seeing young people my age not wanting to have children because they can't afford to. We are seeing an aging population. So I think the biggest thing that Labour could do to try to resolve all this is full proper rent reform, where it's only to the actual like 30% of the average wage in the area, because then that drives house pricing down. It also changes the whole housing market, because the housing market's an absolute fugazi. It's nothing. It's not what it really is. We're making out that, you know, we've all got £350,000 houses in the southeast. No, we don't. We have old council houses that were worth £12,000 literally 10 years ago, and now we're like literally selling them off for more money than we could ever afford. And what are Labour going to actually do to resolve this? Because this is how we really get equality back for everyone.
Excellent question. Sorry, just didn't catch your name.
Ben Cox.
Ben, okay. And final question, sorry, we'll come to the lady here in the third row. Just, there's a microphone coming to you.
Hi, Sarah Hamilton. I'm a paediatrician and I wanted to talk about low paid workers. So as I understand it, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we've got a decrease in the number of people who are working. A huge contributing factor is one in 6 young people aged 18 to 24 are not working. And then the group you talked about, Caroline, 50 to 60. So I wanted to talk about the responsibility of the organizations and the businesses who employ low paid workers, huge number of which are care workers, to actually spend more on maintaining the health of the lowest paid workers in society.
Some excellent questions there. Thank you so much. Actually, Saskia, can I come to you on that last question? And perhaps no. Okay. Who wants to take that last question on low paid workers? It's a really important one. Abby.
Yeah, just really quickly, specifically on care workers, but I think you could probably generalize it to low paid workers more broadly. I mean, part of the issue is that low paid workers, and particularly young low paid workers, have very few rights in the workplace. And this is very clear for care workers. We're doing a lot of work at JRF on the kind of exploitation faced by care workers. And one thing we really support is the idea of fair pay agreements for care workers, which Labour has announced and committed to. And what that will do is sort of ensure and bake into statute and legislation that care workers need to be paid better. Currently, harking back to what I was saying in my sort of opening remarks, these care organisations have very little, requirements to really give care workers very much. They don't pay for sleep-in shifts. They pay them poverty wages. They regularly don't pay them for travel time, which means some of the biggest instances of minimum wage contravention happen in the care system. And actually, HMRC don't really chase it up, because it's a complicated kind of call about whether that is contravention or not. But speak to a care worker who can't make ends meet and put food on the table for their kids. I mean, absolutely, it's a travesty. So I definitely think things like fair pay agreements and anything that will help those lowest paid workers have the bare minimum amount that they need to live on is going to make a huge amount of difference.
Thanks. And it's about quality of work, really, isn't it? As well as pay. We know that for frontline workers, access to flexible working that everyone, or sort of white collar workers, have benefited from during the pandemic has really not extended to them. Liam, do you want to take?
Yeah, so very briefly on inheritance tax, I mean, this isn't something we can avoid really for much longer. So if you've got £5.5 trillion about to cascade down the generations, we are going to have to get our thinking straight on inheritance tax. And some of you might remember there was that kind of hoo-ha when it emerged that the king was not going to pay inheritance tax on the estates that he was going to inherit from the late queen. You know, the truth is he would have been the exception if he did, because the rate of payment of inheritance tax basically collapses over and above estates of £2 million. And so, you know, what most OECD countries have done is instead of having an inheritance tax, they have a gift tax. So it's actually the person who receives the money that pays the tax on a kind of a scale. And so I'm afraid, you know, that is where I end up in the book, that's where we should head to. It's not a straightforward thing, but that's the only way that you can bring a semblance of rationality and fairness to what is going to be a big transfer of wealth. On Ben's point about housing, I mean, Ben, I wouldn't disagree with you about rent reform, and indeed we could have a whole conference about the need to build more homes. I think we've got to acknowledge, though, that still the preference of most renters is to buy a home they call their own. The challenge we've got in Britain today is that only 4% of young people who don't own their own home have got the deposit and the earnings to get a mortgage. And so, you know, the reason I kind of come to that kind of deposit dividend as part of universal basic capital is because £10,000 is the average shortfall that people have on a deposit for a home. You've got to couple that with fixed long-term mortgages, which is something Rachel talked about a week ago. But unless you've got that kind of system change, rent reform, building more homes, and help with the deposit for young people, and if you had tax revenue going into a fund that provided that, you would have that kind of hypothecation between the generations that actually I think it would make it easier to win the tax argument. And then just on low paid workers, the rights at work agenda that we're pursuing is a game changer. You've got to couple that with a single enforcement body, because at the moment it's mad. But, you know, again, if you're going to have system change, follow the money. So the fact that our polling found that 70% of pension savers would switch their pension savings if they found the money was going into bad firms. I mean, that's a hell of a lever that we've got. But that means you've got to have a good definition of good work, which is something the Taylor Review proposed a few years ago. It also means you need workers on boards, because unless you've got reform of the investment market and reform of boardroom governance, you're not going to get the system to shift as a whole.
Yeah, perhaps I could bring two of these questions together a bit. You may not think they're linked, but the one about inheritance tax and also about what to do about low pay staff, particularly in the context of social care. So for once, I'm going to very slightly disagree with something one of the colleagues said, because actually I wish it were true that that we could get lots of money out of nasty firms in social care and that would solve the problem around care. But unfortunately, I don't think that's true. There are some chains that are offshore or whatever who definitely need loads of scrutiny, and it's great to hear that there's a lot of thinking going on about how to do that. But it's a very fragmented market, and about half or more of the beds and the provision in adult social care is from little companies. They're little SMEs and they're not for profits, and they're struggling to make ends meet because the truth of the matter is there's just not enough money in social care. And if you need social care, it's about basically at least £25 an hour. If you need 4 visits a day, it's £100 a day. There are 1.6 million older people not getting the care they need. It's a car crash, and it's something that is one of those big, really difficult problems to fix, which faces Labour if it gets into government, which it essentially at the moment is saying will more or less make a second-term priority to fix. But when they do really address this, the big question to face is, where does the sustainable income stream come from in order to fund a better care system, a national care service? Because it's going to need a lot more money. And one of the potential answers is a reform to inheritance tax, actually. So yes, of course, we need to do things to inheritance tax because it's not working. Yes, we need to try and equalise the inequality within generations, but we also need to fix social care. So when it comes to rethinking inheritance tax, I hope Liam and other colleagues will also bear in mind that it is potentially one of the sources for that sustainable income stream.
Thanks, Caroline. I think I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. I'm going to come to the panel for their final reflections. Liam, I'll come to you first. And just one question for each of you. We know that getting progress on these many issues will require, really effective, competent government. And poverty is the mission that we're missing in some ways. We have the 5 missions, but poverty cuts across many of them. So Liam, what would you like to see the government doing in terms of its mission-based approach to government and taking many of these issues that we've heard today forward?
So I'd be interested in people's views about missions. I mean, I think that you have got to make sure that as we get closer to the election, there is a kind of a more singular purpose to the missions. So the missions kind of cover the right things, but ultimately the Labour Party is a movement for fairness, and that's kind of why we were built, all those years ago. And our basic insight is that, the Tories are a me party. We're a we party. We believe that each of us and every one of us can achieve more in life together if we do some certain things together. And that requires building a fairer society. And so what I would like us to say a little bit more about is how we build a fairer future with pride in our past. But that fairness, that war on poverty, has got to be something that cuts right the way through the missions, because ultimately people know that we're going in the wrong direction right now because we're becoming a divided society, and they know that as a nation we are stronger when we pull together, but that means looking after each other. And that, I think, is actually something that can inspire people, give people not only a sense of direction, but crucially, the thing that is really missing right now on the doorstep is a sense of hope. And that, above all, is what we've got to supply.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liam. Caroline.
I absolutely agree with what Liam's just said. And I think we can be a bit optimistic, because one of the things successive recent governments haven't done is to try to use the power of the state to address social problems. And, if an incoming Labour government doesn't do that, I will be A, surprised, and B, bitterly disappointed. There is so much more we can do through using the state, and I hope we will.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about good work again. It cuts across all of the missions. To achieve the higher sustained growth in the G7, we need to be a productive country. We cannot be a productive country if people are having bad experiences at work. The same with breaking down barriers at every life stage. We've got teachers, kind of leaving in their hundreds of thousands. The same with the NHS. So I think just central to all of this, and I'm really, really pleased that Labour has got that kind of New Deal for working people legislation pledge in the first 100 days, because I think that is going to underpin everything that we do.
Abby.
Oh my gosh, having the last word is very scary in this kind of moment. But I would, but really agree with most of what the panel has said. I mean, I just hark back to what I said in my opening remarks, that actually, when you speak to voters and when you poll voters, the thing they are most concerned about is the ability for them to make ends meet. And it's been a very difficult few years. For many, it's been a very difficult 14 years. And they will be thinking about whether the next government is going to make them more wealthy, make their communities more thriving, and help them make ends meet. And ultimately, I'm really grateful that actually this discussion has been about creative ways that the next government could pay for some of the changes needed, because this isn't going to come for free. And I don't think voters think that it's going to come for free either. And so being able to have those difficult conversations with people, but equally being able to, as Liam said, show that there is sort of hope at the end of it, I think will be really, really central.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've had some wonderful contributions, some fantastic questions from the floor. So please join me in thanking the panel, and thank you for your questions. On time.
Thank you very much.
Very much.